Thank you, David. Thank you to everyone for logging in. I'm just going to share my screen. Play from the start. There we go. Can you all see that? A thumbs up from someone on camera? Grand. If I just get rid of that. I put my slides on. I don't have the design qualities of William Morris. So my slides aren't the best in the world, but that's a picture of E.P. Thompson with a cat. So that's always a nice place, I think, to start. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm just going to explore sort of one theme in the work of William Morris. That's the inevitability of socialism and the impact that that belief has on certain aspects of his sort of socialist thought. And I'd like to stress sort of here at the beginning that I'm not offering sort of a wholesale picture of Morris's socialism, but one aspect, sort of one side of it. And I think maybe you could say it's a fairly unfashionable side, perhaps, but that it is nevertheless an important part of his outlook. I will note also that there could have been an alternative version of this talk called Morris and the Inevitability of Socialism, but the Necessity of Communism. And we can talk about that a little more in the Q&A. But just to say, Morris believed pretty much in sort of a stage process whereby socialism was a phase on the way to a full communism, or the phrase he used in News from Nowhere, which was a complete communism. So he used both terms, but mostly socialism was the broader movement. And when he wanted to distinguish himself, his position in relation to others within that movement, he would call himself communist. But with that said, I will mostly be referring to socialism in this talk. Before I get into kind of the bulk of the paper, I'm just going to say a few words about sort of my approach to Morris. Okay. So if one takes even a brief look at the life of William Morris, one is immediately struck by simply how active he was across a number of fields. He was a celebrated poet, a writer of historical and prose romances, and a translator of classical and Norse literature. He was a designer, an artist, and a craftsman, and relatedly a businessman who was an influential figure in the arts and crafts movement. He was a campaigning preservationist, and in the last years of his life, he founded the Kelmscott Press, an influential marker in the fine press movement. And the picture on the right that you can see there is sort of the opening of the Kelmscott Press News from Nowhere. In 1883, a year before his 50th birthday, he joined what was then called the Democratic Federation, and for the rest of the decade was one of the leading socialist campaigners in the country. At the end of 1884, Morris was a leading member of the group who split from what was then the Social Democratic Federation, and he formed the Socialist League, the organization he would stay with until 1890, when he left that organization and formed the Hammersmith Socialist Society. Now, any scholar approaching Morris's socialism has to consider how much of this life's work makes it into their account of his politics. Now, most often, usually this would take sort of place within a debate about the place of romanticism in Morris's socialism. And this would be this is emphasized perhaps by the subtitle of E.P. Thompson's impressively long 1955 book, which comes in at just over 900 pages, William Morris, Romantic to Revolutionary. And scholars have explored how much Morris's romanticism, usually manifesting in his concern for art and beauty, not only inflected, but directed his socialist thought, often emphasizing these continuities over perhaps earlier Marxist scholarship, Marxist and communist scholarship, that saw a more definite break in his thought on his entrance to the socialist movement, and particularly on his reading of Marx. My own approach has been to focus on his most active years in the socialist movement, and particularly to examine the importance of Commonweal, the journal of the Socialist League, and how this impacted his own political project and his own political development. On the left, you can see that's the opening of News from Nowhere as it appeared in Commonweal when it was serialized in 1890. But what was that project? Well, Morris's answer to the classic question, what is to be done, was always clear. The answer was to make socialists. So I quote, "The work that lies before us at present is to make socialists, to cover the country with a network of associations composed of men who feel their antagonism to the dominant classes and have no temptation to waste their time in the thousand follies of party politics." And I'll point out for any sort of new left fans listening that Stuart Hall ended the opening editorial of the New Left Review with that quote. He opened with a Morris quote as well in that sort of opening editorial. But as we know, socialism, or we should know, some people I don't think do, socialism as a term could and still does encompass a wide variety of viewpoints, and Morris's goal was to make socialists of a revolutionary stripe. His task was not just of making socialists, but of shaping them. And a key plank in this education towards revolution was criticism of reformist and parliamentary versions of socialism. An important part, but no means the only part, of his project was the Socialist League's journal, Commonweal. Morris wrote for, edited, and financed the paper, and the paper as a whole should be considered an important part of Morris's political project. So part of what I was trying to do in the thesis was to look at Commonweal as a site of intellectual production and exchange, to see how Morris both shaped and was himself shaped by that collective process. Okay, so let's get on to the inevitability of socialism. Oh, click. And I'm afraid I do have quite a few long quotes in this talk, but I will read them out and have them on the slides as well. So let's kick off with this from The Hopes of Civilization, a lecture he first gave in 1885. To Germany we owe the school of economists at whose head stands the name of Karl Marx, who have made socialism what it is. The earlier socialist writers and preachers based their hopes on man being taught to see the desirableness of cooperation taking the place of competition and adopting the change voluntarily and consciously. But the new school, starting with an historical view of what had been and seeing that a law of evolution swayed all events in it, was able to point out to us that the evolution was still going on and that whether socialism be desirable or not, it is at least inevitable. Now, if this quote sort of sounds like perhaps fairly sort of boilerplate scientific socialism of sort of the late 19th century and the Second International, that's because it is. That's not said to denigrate either the statement or Morris, but it's to situate him within an era and tradition of socialism, confident that the laws of history were on its side. So one line of sort of scholarly inquiry has been to take Morris's socialist thought and his vision, you could say, as an attempt to make socialism desirable. This perhaps would take place a discussion of his utopianism, with the most famous articulation probably being that of E.P. Thompson again, this time in the postscript to his revised Morris book. Now, the revised edition is shorter, just coming in at just over 800 pages after he took out what he called his Stalinist pieties. And in that postscript, drawing on the work of Miguel Abansur, Thompson argued that in Morris we get the proper and newfound space for utopia, which was the education of desire. So this utopian sort of side, along with his concern for design, art, beauty, and also the environment, is probably the more fashionable side of Morris and the one that would get most attention these days. And I say I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But I think it's arguable that you don't get that more fashionable side, perhaps about this side that I'm going to be talking about today. So, just that image on the right is that's Morris's copy of the French edition of Capital, which he had rebound in sort of that sort of gold leaf. He had it rebound by Thomas Cobden Sanderson. So Morris accepted the line that the school of socialism associated with Marx, what Engels called scientific socialism as opposed to earlier utopian socialism, had shown that history was progressing inexorably like a law of nature towards socialism. Morris had read Marx's Capital in the French edition in 1883 and famously, or infamously, struggled with what he called the pure economics in it, but did stress that he enjoyed the historical parts. He also learned a great deal from his peers, especially Henry Mayers Hindman before the split from the Social Democratic Federation, but also from Ernest Belfort Bax and Edward Aveling. Hindman and Bax have been fairly sort of deserved by quite a lot of 20th century scholarship, mostly by Marxist scholars, because both pretty much kind of disagreed with Engels at certain points. But there has been some good work recently, particularly by Seamus Flaherty in his recent book, that sort of recovers their thought and sort of seeks to, he says, rescue them from the condescension of posterity, to aping Thompson's line, which is quite nice, but it's a good book. But in the early days of Commonweal, it was Edward Aveling who did the most to push sort of the scientific nature of Marx's work. Aveling has also been routinely demonized by posterity, I think probably much more fairly because of his personal life. But in the socialist movement of this period, he was at least a respected figure. He was brought in by Engels to help Samuel Moore on the translation of Volume 1 of Capital, even if Engels didn't really entirely trust his abilities. But Engels writes a series of articles. They were called Lessons in Socialism, of which you can see the example of one of them on the screen there. And these were based on lectures he was giving that tried to explain Capital and Marx to the journal's readers. It was an attempt, Aveling said, and I quote, give some evidence of the fact that socialism is based on grounds as scientific and as irrefragable as the theory of evolution. And that just as Darwin was and is my master in biological science, so is Marx my master in economics, and for exactly the same reasons. Now, one of the problems of Aveling's series, which are actually, in fairness, a reasonably good précis of Capital, is that in the course of a year, he only actually manages to get up to chapter 10, which is the chapter on the working day. So he's pretty much just covering the difficult early bits. And you can see the example there, there's quite a lot of equations in his account. But this meant that the reception of his articles was not always positive. John Lincoln Mahon, a member of the Executive Council of the Socialist League, wrote in from a regional branch, and I quote, that Aveling on Marx is a matter for general astonishment. Most readers are utterly perplexed as to the meaning of it all. Only one member of the branch reads them, and he does it despite the rest of the members. As I said, he only got up to sort of chapter 10. His series stopped rather abruptly at the same time as he stepped away from his role as the sub-editor of Commonweal, with the paper switched to a weekly publication in May of 1886. However, in 1887, shortly after the publication of the English version of Capital, Morris and Bax, who I mentioned, cover the whole book in about 7 articles as part of their series, Socialism from the Root Up. There, they describe scientific socialism as the complete socialist theory, with Marx as its great exponent. And the overall presentation of Capital, probably slightly easier to pass than Aveling's account. It certainly brings out more of the history and politics in the book. They also quote from the famous passage towards the end of Capital, where Marx writes, I quote, that capitalistic production begets with the inexorability of a law of nature, its own negation. The important historical takeaway from Marx, from Morris at least, is that history is moving towards socialism. Okay, but what is it about the development of capitalism that means it is doomed for Morris? So let's return to the hopes of civilization, the lecture again. I quote, moreover, the capitalist or modern slave owner has been forced by his very success to organize his slaves, the wage earners, into a cooperation for production so well arranged that it requires little but his own elimination to make it a foundation for communal life. His own advance in wealth and power has bred for him the very enemy who is doomed to make an end of him. Or we could borrow from the Communist Manifesto that what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. So for most, capitalism, in order to maximize its profits, brings workers together into a close cooperation, and by exploiting them to the utmost, gives them ever-increasing reason to combine politically for their betterment. Capitalism's recurring and growing crises will provide the opportunity to workers sufficiently organized and prepared to eliminate the capitalist and take over organization of industry, society, and their own lives. Now, it should be no real surprise that Morris, with his passionate interest in the practices of medieval craftsmen, did not think that it was the productive capacities of capitalism that made socialism possible. Certainly, he thought these would be useful in smoothing whatever transition there was, but in itself, it was nothing to be celebrated. It was an age of shoddy goods and environmental destruction, after all. But arguably also Marx, or at least the Marx in Volume 1 of Capital, thought the same. As William Clare Roberts has recently argued, nowhere in Volume 1 does Marx, and I quote, argue or imply that capitalism has developed human productive powers to the point where we can meet everyone's needs, or that such a development would constitute a threshold before which the attainment of communism would be impossible. Rather, the power developed by capitalism is the power to destroy workers' lives, and that this power is the development of the material conditions of communism, for the simple reason that capitalism gives to the laboring class a powerful motive to cooperate in the construction of a new society. Okay, So for Morris, socialism will come about because the workers realized that they, rather than just being a class, they should be a society. And then they can assert their collective strength in making it so. But there was another view of the coming of socialism, and one Morris sought to combat. So my friend and yours, the Fabians, the original Fabian coat of arms there on the left, they ditched it fairly quickly, I think. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing, presumably waiting 130 years to publish whatever that was a few weeks ago from Keir Starmer. But the Fabians believed that progress towards socialism was well underway in Britain. And the principal cause of this was the progress of democracy. Sidney Webb argued that there was growing, and I quote, consensus that the inevitable outcome of democracy is the control by the people themselves, not only of their own political organization, but through that, also of the main instruments of wealth production, that the economic side of democratic ideas is in fact socialism itself. So for Webb, and here a quote on the screen, the steady increase of the government regulation of private enterprise, the growth of municipal administration, and the rapid shifting of the burden of taxation directly to rent and interest mark in treble lines the statesman's unconscious abandonment of the old individualism and our irresistible glide into collectivist socialism. So an important aspect of this analysis was that socialism was actually being brought about unconsciously. Now, elsewhere in the Fabian essays, Graham Wallis wrote of, and I quote, the steady introduction of socialistic institutions by men who reject socialist ideas. And likewise, George Bernard Shaw argued that we are already far on the road towards socialism and are being urged further by many politicians who do not dream that they are touched with socialism, nay, who would earnestly repudiate the touch as a taint. But as Seamus Flaherty has recently shown in his book, that was not necessarily a new observation. The slow introduction of socialistic measures by the state, or sort of a germ theory of socialism, had been debated within the periodical press, with Henry Fawcett a decade before the Fabians writing that many of those who regard the spread of socialism with so much alarm have been unconsciously the chief promoters of the movement. Perhaps the most famous example of this would be in 1884 in Herbert Spencer's The Man versus the State, which viewed the continued growth of state legislation and interference in society as a sign of the coming slavery. And one of Spencer's targets in that is actually the program of the Social Democratic Federation, of which Morris was a member of at the time. But this is a very different, inevitable and irresistible glide to socialism than that pictured by Morris. And Morris thought that the Fabians were prone to, as he says, overestimate the importance of the mechanism of a system of society, apart from the end toward which it may be used. So while the state will be involved in socialism, the state doing stuff is not itself socialism. And he worried that the Fabians had the potential to, and I quote, produce the impression that we are already in the first stages of socialistic life. So if Sir William Harcourt could exclaim that we are all socialists now, Morris would reply, are we indeed? Well, I must say in that case, we need not have taken the trouble to become socialists. Now, Morris had many problems with what he called sort of soft socialists or semi-socialists, such as the Fabians. And News from Nowhere is as much an attack on the Fabians as it is a response to Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. But his main issue with sort of such socialists was that they preached great change without the class struggle, which he felt was, as a position, was an absurdity and an impossibility. And occasionally, you might still see some people claiming that Morris's socialism kind of had little to do with class, that it was all about fellowship. It's nonsense. I mean, fellowship is important, but class is also front and center, as this, which is one of my favorite Morris quotes. It is most important that young socialists should have this fact of the class war always before them. It explains past history, and in the present gives us the only solid hope for the future. And it must be understood that it is only by the due working out of this class war to its end, the abolition of classes, that socialism can come about. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to a couple of areas in which Morris thought that this sort of inevitable arrival of socialism could be delayed. So if class struggle is the key to the achievement of socialism, it was crucial, Morris thought, to make workers aware that a class struggle was actually going on. And an important strand of this was, of course, the sort of socialist propaganda that Morris and others were undertaking week in, week out, on street corners, up and down the country, and in pamphlets and in papers. But while important, and it is important to Morris, Morris did not believe that persuasion was enough. So there's this quote from Commonweal in December 1886. No amount of preaching, of enthusiasm, or of devotion even, will induce the workers with whom the world's future lies to accept and act upon mere abstract propositions of what they have a right to aspire to. Necessity must push them on before they can even conceive of the future of equality and mutual goodwill which we know awaits them. Morris always struggled with tone when he was writing. He was never 100% sure who his audience is. One's never quite sure if he's addressing people like himself or addressing would-be potential socialists. So education and preaching was useful, Morris thought, but more so to people already interested, to shape them into certain directions. But only necessity could really make the masses of the workers conscious of the class struggle in the first place. And it was for this reason, this is the main reason that Morris was opposed to reformist schemes that he thought would counteract increasing class polarization. To Morris, philanthropic and reform schemes that invested sections of the working class further into the existing system, creating new intermediate and middle classes, were to be fought against. The Manifesto of the Socialist League, which was co-written by Morris, had criticized cooperative societies that by themselves, and I quote, would merely increase the number of small joint stock capitalists under the mask of creating an aristocracy of labor. Other reforms or concessions to the working class that left the present system of capital and wages intact were similarly suspect. Who wasn't a fan of Henry George's sort of land reform or single taxes? And his suspicion and distrust of many trade unions, especially before the emergence of new unionism towards the end of the 1880s, was based on a similar thought. He thought they were pretty much just benefit societies for their members, but uninterested in wider social change. So what does Morris think socialists should sort of say in response to these sort of trends and tendencies and schemes? This is from the same article. To assert the necessity of the wage workers, not only of all countries, but also of all conditions, to unite, to refuse to admit any distinction between skilled and unskilled, employed or unemployed, must be our answer to the bourgeois attempt at building up a new middle class. And socialists must consider that if that tendency becomes a fact and the new class does grow up, it will show that we have been mistaken in supposing that the present system was rotting to its end. It would mean that socialism was put off not for 50 years, but for centuries. Note, though, that he still doesn't say that it will avert socialism entirely. It's just going to delay it, perhaps for a very long time. It is still inevitable, after all, however long it takes. So it could still be inevitable, fingers crossed. But Morris was aware that his position against reforms that could improve the lot of poor workers, it ran the risk of making him look unsympathetic, especially given his own considerable wealth and comfort. But Morris's aim, he would say, was always to change the position of the working class, not just their condition. To him, who, and let's be clear, never held a normal wage-based job in his life, wage slavery was still wage slavery, even if the wage went up. Morris was sympathetic, and he was. But as he put it, and I quote, "It is unheard of and impossible that birth should take place without struggle and suffering, but in spite of that, we long for the birth." Now, it's obviously easier to say that if you're not the one suffering. Okay, we're going to move on to the next sort of thing that can delay socialism, that's imperialism. That's a picture of Ernest Belfort Bax on the left there. Terrific moustache, but I do have to say he was also a terrible misogynist. He had some awful ideas and vehemently hated the idea of women's suffrage. And the picture on the right is Walter Crane's The Capitalist Vampire, which I put simply because I think I've put it in every presentation I've ever done. You know, it's the vampire capitalism that lives only by sucking living labor. Okay, so let's talk about anti-imperialism. And it should be stressed that Morris was not an anti-imperialist because he was a socialist. After all, many socialists throughout history have been quite fond of aspects of imperialism. Indeed, in Morris's case, it kind of goes perhaps the other way. His opposition to imperialism and to British foreign policy are part of his move towards socialism, but then it takes on a different form. Morris had been involved in liberal agitation over British foreign policy in the late 1870s, but gradually and then finally lost any hope in liberals and radicals to effectively oppose national chauvinism. And one of Morris's justifications for splitting from the Social Democratic Federation was that Hindman was something of a jingo and acted too much like a politician. And here's why Bax is here, because in Commonweal, the most prominent writer of imperialism was Ernest Belfort Bax. Bax's articles on imperialism and British policy had a strong influence on Morris. To Bax, all imperial expansion was the necessary result of capitalism's need for new markets, and all foreign policy, colonial expansion and its resulting conflict was, and I quote, to provide fields for the relief of native surplus capital and merchandise. One article in particular made Morris think and perhaps to worry as well. In July 1888, Bax considered the historical ramifications of the recent attempt by European nations to partition and exploit Africa, so from scrambled for Africa. Given the speed at which capital operates, Bax saw that this so-called opening up of Africa meant, and I quote, untold mineral, vegetable, and animal wealth played at the disposal of the modern commercial system. A new world of markets, limitless cheap labor, and practically boundless territories for emigrations. Bax, though, he reaffirms his belief, and I quote, that the next definite stage in human evolution must be the beginning of socialism. But he says, it is quite conceivable, to say the least, that the present stage should be prolonged in a slightly changed form, perhaps, even for another century. Again, note how he's saying, this will not wholly avert socialism, just substantially delay it. It is still the definite stage of the next definite stage of human evolution. Now, Morris did something he didn't normally do to articles in Commonweal. He referred to it and talked about it in his notes on news in the same issue. Now, here he made an important admission that too many socialists, I quote, even those most sincere in their professions of internationalism, are too apt to limit our scope of vision to civilized countries. But adds, I think in a demonstration probably of his lack of sort of belief in real cultural equality, that barbarous ones are at any rate of the kind of importance that the lamb is to the wolf. It's possible sometimes to read Morris's use of phrases like civilized and barbarous as sort of an ironic sort of inversion of those things. He did sort of say one of his main driving motives was a hatred of civilization. And he sometimes thought that sort of socialists were new Goths tearing down sort of this faux civilization. But sometimes there is definitely a sort of a condescension or a belief in a sort of lack of equality between these things. But he added his own thoughts on Bax's article on whether imperialism could renew capitalism. And I quote, whether the nourishment to be afforded to capitalism by the Dark Continent is as great as our comrade seems to think, whether the accelerated pace which the impulse of huge new markets would certainly give to competitive commerce would not go far to neutralize the advantages to capitalism opening up Africa, whether at least it would not make the breakup more complete when it came. Or again, if Africa is falling into the grasp of capitalism grown conscious of its necessities for new markets, is there anything which can prevent it from becoming the new nourishment for capitalism? So I'm not going to make sort of a claim that Morris was actually in some form of an accelerationist, or that he welcomed the accelerated sort of pace of capitalist development in Africa. But it's worth noting here that here and elsewhere, he skirts around the edges of some pretty big questions. Here, he suggests possibly that imperialism is kind of a mixed blessing. It's not good now, but it may be an historically necessary phase that will make the end of capitalism when it comes more definite. Much more often, though, he is resolutely opposed to imperialism, and he has a kind of a twofold critique. At the base level, continuing on from his pre-socialist critique, he kind of just thinks it's morally wrong, especially the violence involved. Joined to this is the belief that the new resources and markets will give capitalism, both home and abroad, a new strength, possibly delaying the arrival of socialism, as Back said, for maybe even another century. This in turn made the moral critique more urgent in order to try and build up opposition amongst the public. Morris and others in common will frequently attack those involved in imperialist adventures, especially figures, and he was a common target, was Henry Morton Stanley. Morris suggested he should be tried for murder on his return to England. And they also attack jingoistic sections of the British press who support British action abroad, and they attack the religious cover given to sort of imperialism and British policy as the sort of supposed civilizing mission. A final point to make here on sort of imperialism or the wider world as well is whether Morris thought socialism was inevitable everywhere, or what the route to socialism for non-advanced capitalist countries was. Would imperialism and bringing them into the capitalist system also bring them onto an historical developmental path to socialism? Now, he only really ventures this topic in one other place, and this is written in combination with Bax. This is part of the Socialism from the Root Up series that I mentioned. A question may occur to some as to the probable future of the races at present outside civilization. To us, it seems that the best fate that can befall them is that they should develop themselves from their present condition, uninterfered with by the incongruities of civilization. Those of them will be the happiest who can hold civilization aloof until civilization itself melts into socialism, when their own natural development will gradually lead them into absorption in the great ocean of universal social life. So these are undeveloped thoughts, but they do at least, Morris and Bax, consider that if socialism is going to be such a welcome improvement, it might be worth thinking about how all peoples and countries may be able to enjoy it. And here they suggest, contrary to the historical evolution of Britain and other advanced capitalist countries, that it may well be possible to get to socialism via another route, that of the influence of socialist countries once they get there. And what you can also see here, and this is quite common in Morris, is sort of this use of organic language, melts, absorption, natural. It gives the impression that this such a process will be as simple and involve little by way of political struggle. So in summing up now, I'm just going to say a few words about this sort of underplaying of the difficulties of future political transition. That's the Hammersmith branch of the Socialist League. So if history is the unfolding of class struggle and what socialism achieves is the abolition of classes, Morris thinks that once this has happened, pretty much all the key major questions of organization will be fairly easy to solve. To be sure, the class war and the revolutionary fight for socialism will itself be difficult, very difficult. And as he depicts it in News from Nowhere, in the long chapter in the middle, how the change came about, it will probably contain violent struggle. It's almost a civil war in Morris's depiction. But once achieved, the actual reorganization of society will be a relatively peaceful and uncomplicated process. In his discussion of Morris's critique of the market and what would replace it, Noel Thompson argued that though Morris, and I quote, posed many of the crucial questions, this was the extent of his achievement, but he failed to grasp just how difficult, with the abandonment of the market, such questions became, and that it was here that Morris was culpable not in the sense of failing to provide satisfactory answers to questions of pricing, distribution, and allocation under socialism, but in his failure to appreciate and tendency to evade their complexity. And again, he also says, just as in certain circumstances, a deterministic theory of history could breed political quiescence, it could also engender an intellectual passivity as regards the constructive aspect of socialism. Raymond Williams has a similar critique of Morris about the wanting desire to avoid complexity in his socialist thought. But Morris's position is in identifying the root problem of capitalism as the inequality of class society and private property. Well, once these have been abolished, he thought a just and workable organizational structure for society would be a simple task, one that could be achieved by free and equal citizens who actively wanted to take part in the management of their own affairs. But does it matter, though, that Morris failed to think through these issues in depth? Despite the utopian aspects to his thought, he never claimed to be writing, as the phrase goes, of recipes for the cookshops of the future. He always said that the details of future organizations and structures would be a matter for the people of the future, who, free from capitalism, would be in a position to adequately solve whatever problems they faced. He was a propagandist. His goal was to make socialists, the people who perhaps ultimately would have to make those decisions. He thought that socialism was inevitable and saw it as his task to make and shape socialists, who would then in turn fight to move it in a truly revolutionary direction, as opposed to the soft socialists who, to Morris's eyes, simply didn't think boldly enough about the potential changes, and they missed the essence of the matter. If Morris was able to imagine a communist world full of art and beauty and environmental balance, it was because he was convinced that capitalism was doomed. So he had the time and he had the ability to think about shaping the possibilities of shaping that world in a better direction that were worth thinking about. So that's that, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions on that and anything Morris related.